Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
My name is Lydia, and I'm one of the pastors here. And I got a bit of a story before we kind of get into things this morning. So a few years ago, we were looking as a school for some place to partner for short-term missions for our high school students. We now have that with PAC in West Park, and we go down to Mexico and we work with Sahid and Lulu at the orphanage, and we also, as a high school, go and visit this little community in the mountain area called San Pablito, and it's been a really cool partnership, and we were looking for something like that. And actually, West Park is going again a year from now, and we already have the slots full of students who are excited to go, so that's pretty cool. But we were looking for something like that, and this is before we knew about Sahid and Lulu. And so we heard of this organization out of BC that put schools and churches in touch with partners in different areas so that you could arrange a short-term missions trip and you could go down and continue to go to the same place, so the school would always go down there. And we were kind of interested in a partnership that would include PAC as well. So we were kind of excited about this idea, and I chatted with the guy who leads the organization, and it sounded like a really potentially good thing to do. So we decided what we would do is that we would go on a scouting trip, and I would take a bunch of teachers who had gone on trips before, and we decided to take Ray from the church so that when we got back, Ray and I could chat with Nathan about whether that was a good idea for the partnership and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, the guy who was running the organization, he knew I was the principal of the school, the pastor in charge, and so it would be my decision, kind of what we did. There's a few things that I was a little bit questioning about, just because they wanted a lot of control over the trips, and so I just wanted to make sure that I was putting the students in good hands, for lack of a better word. So we chose Kevin to go with us. At the time, he and I were engaged, so it was slightly awkward, but not too super awkward. There was other people going too. Because he had taken kids down to Guatemala before, actually, with West Park. We'd gone to a different organization. And he's a teacher at the school, and so that made sense. We took another teacher at the time here, Brian, and his wife, Arlene, and then we took Ray. And so the five of us got in this minivan, and we drove to Minneapolis, got on a plane, got to Houston, Texas, where we met up with Steve. I think his name is Steve. It's been a while, but I'm pretty sure that was his name. We'll call him Steve anyway, it doesn't really matter. So sometimes I can struggle if I'm put into a position where I have to be a follower. I'd rather be the leader, especially if I don't 100% have confidence in the person who's doing the leading. So I decided before we went, though, that this was going to be I was going to go like I was a high school student. I wasn't going to go and have leadership ideas for Steve. I was going to go and have ministry ideas for Steve and whether this would be a great opportunity. So it kind of got off to a rocky start because we had just got off a plane, the five of us, met Steve. Then Steve explains to us how to board a plane. So, so I think, he's just eager. He's used to taking high school students who maybe they had never had traveled internationally, like every single one of us on this scouting trip had. But we'll just give him a break. And then Steve explains to us how the best place to go for missions opportunities is Haiti, not Guatemala, which is where we were going. So he tells us all of these great facts about Haiti and all the cool things that he's done there on short-term mission trips, which is interesting, but kind of annoying because I'd like to hear about Guatemala. But that's okay. So then we get to the Guatemala airport. And Brian and Kevin had actually just got back after taking a group of students to another opportunity in Guatemala. So they were pretty familiar with this airport. Steve had never been there, but we still had to follow Steve. So we went the wrong way, even though Kevin and Brian are it's up there. We're still going this way. Steve's going to be the leader, so that's fine. When Steve suggested that we all give him our passports, I think I drew the line. I'm I'm not actually willing to put that kind of faith in you, dude. Now, once we got to meet the people in Guatemala, it was actually really cool. It was a really cool partnership possibility. What it was actually a church that was an alliance church like ours, and they had these little multi-site churches all around their town, which is what we at the time were dreaming of being. And then they also had schools. And so it really fit in with everything that PAC was about and is about, and so it was actually really cool. And the people there were really, really good. But we actually even also got to be there during Easter when all their congregations got together, and it was really cool to see all those people come together from different communities to celebrate Easter. But then there was Steve. So in the whole process, it was pretty clear that I was the one who was in charge of whether or not this partnership became a thing. But that didn't meet Steve's expectations of what it would be. So I noticed this a little bit at the beginning of our conversations when we got to Guatemala, and Steve would talk about the nuts and bolts of whether or not this partnership would work with Ray and Brian and Kevin. And then he'd say, "Lydia, do you feel sad when you see all the poverty?" I'm like, maybe. So how would it work for the students? Like, how long would you expect a missions trip would be? And he would kind of look at me and go, "So Brian, do you think that it would be good for like a 10-day trip, or do you think that a different kind of trip would work?" And I'd be like, "What the heck, man?" So this kind of kept going on and on and on. At one point, there's two of my points, two parts of this story that I think are kind of funny. At one point, he asked me to go make guacamole, which I'm not sure if that was to like get me out of the room so I'd stop talking and asking these questions that were clearly annoying him, or if he really wanted guacamole. But I'm like, I'm in Guatemala. I can't make guacamole as well as the people who live in Guatemala can, so I just went and bought some. And then he got mad because I hadn't made it. It was weird. But the other part, and I can actually still feel my like anger rising as I tell you this. The other part of this of our trip that is very memorable is the time when he pulled Kevin aside and said, "Are you sure that you want to marry such a strong-willed, unsubmissive wife?" Yeah, it's a good thing Kevin's like a pacifist, because otherwise Steve would have a sore nose. Not cool, Steve. So I was actually really tempted to write off the organization because of this thing with Steve, but there was a bunch of other things that went on, and as we talked about it, it didn't really work and the timing wasn't right. And one of the things that this organization said was a kind of a no questions of that made us say no to it was they didn't want us to take kids down who weren't completely like fully followers of Jesus Christ. They didn't want anyone who was searching. And at West Park, it's a pretty big value of ours that we are open, and we want to make sure that families and kids who are searching for their faith are able to find a place where they can meet Jesus. And so sometimes a missions trip is a great place. But if you have to go testimony in hand, ready to tell other people about Jesus when you're not really sure yourself, I didn't want to put the kids in that spot. And so that's mainly the reason why we decided not to. Just so you know, it wasn't just about Steve. But as I think about that, and I think about the emotion that even now, like this is 8 years ago that this happened, that I still have about it, like I'm still kind of annoyed and baffled and frustrated and angry that you would be faced with this is who it was. And I'm not sure if it really was because I was a female or if it was because I was the youngest person on the trip, but it doesn't really matter. When you boil it all down, Steve had expectations for me that didn't fit with what God had called me to do. When you actually boil it down, that's what's going on. Steve thinks I should be like this, and God says I'm like this. And it's okay to be like this if this is who God's called you to be. But if God's called you to be something different, expectations can then collide with that. And even if it's a guy that you meet at the Houston airport who plays Farmville on his BlackBerry all the way to Guatemala City, it still gives you an emotional response. So imagine if it wasn't some guy that I met in the airport, Steve. Imagine if that was like my dad, who had those kinds of expectations. My dad didn't, but other people's dads do have those kinds of expectations on them for what they're going to do and what they should do. And sometimes those expectations conflict with what God says we are and what God says that we should do. And when that happens, there's an even bigger emotional weight. And it's not just a funny story with a little bit of anger still there 8 years later. It's a big thing. It's a big deal. That's the kind of expectations that are put on the disciples in the next little part of Mark. There is an expectation, and it's not an expectation that's even said. It was such an expectation for Steve that I be a certain person that he never sat down and said, so, the way I see it is the guys are in charge of the trip and you're along for the ride. It was so much ingrained in him that he didn't have to verbalize that. Kind of like when I was a kid, my mom and dad, they didn't ask if I was going to church, they asked where I was going to church. It was an assumed thing that I would be, right? That kind of thing. So this emotional weight gets put on these people. And so as we dive into this next part of Mark, think about that expectation. Maybe there's a story in your life like mine where you have somebody had an expectation for you. Maybe it wasn't a big deal, but it was a deal. Maybe it was a huge deal and you had to break free from that. But that's what's going on here. So if you can think of that kind of story and think about the emotions that come across during that time, as we read about these disciples, we'll kind of get how they're feeling and what is actually going on there. So Mark chapter 1, verse 16. One day, as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Now, Simon is going to be known as Peter pretty quickly, just as a spoiler. And so this is the guy who's telling Mark all of these stories. Peter is the guy that we get the book of Mark from. Remember that back from the first sermon that Nathan talked about Mark. And sometimes because we can go straight through this verse, we can actually kind of miss what's happening. So I want to just park here for a little bit. Simon and Andrew fish for a living. This isn't a summer job. They're not doing something while they wait for their lives to get started. This is life. They aren't on a gap year looking for something exciting to do and fishing came up and this is what they're stuck with. This is who they are. This is what they do. And they're brothers working together. And later on you see more brothers working together that will come. And what you know by this is that this is a family business. So this isn't something that Peter or Simon has decided to leave home and become a fisher. He's actually grown up watching his dad go out to sea, bring in the fish, and no one ever asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. Nobody's ever said to him, hey, are you going to be like your dad and be a fisher? No, it's just expected that that's what he's going to do. Simon and Andrew probably played along the shore watching their dad. They probably played in the boats close to the shore when they were little, and they probably pretended to fish because they knew this is what they were going to do. At this time, this is what you did. You did what your dad did. You didn't have a choice. It's just expected. The expectations of the family is that Simon and Andrew are going to eventually take over this business, and then their sons will take over the business, and their sons will take over the business. And for centuries, this is what's happened in this area. This family has fished the Sea of Galilee. This family has made their living this way. They can't just abandon it, walk away because some guy comes up to them. And so Jesus walks down this bustling shoreline, full of fishers and other people going about their business, and he sees these two guys. And they're fulfilling the expectation of their family, and they're fulfilling the expectations of their society. And he gives them like this super cheesy line to quit your job and follow him. Have you noticed how cheesy this is? Like, how does this work? Let's look at verse 17. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. Well, sign me up. That doesn't make sense. But it actually ends up working. Let's go to the next verse. It says, at once they left their nets and followed him. And that doesn't just work once. Because if we keep going in 19 and 20, it says, a little further, when he had gone a little further, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. Again, you've got another family business that's just being abandoned. And it doesn't look like Zebedee has other sons to pass this fishing business to. He's left with the hired help. They're not working for the family. They're working for money that they have to then fish for these people as well, right? So it's not the same responsibility on a hired person than it is on a family business. And so they actually drop their families and society's expectations of them to follow Jesus. And at some point, we're going to be called, and we're all called, to follow Jesus. And when we have to say yes to him, that means we do have to say no to other things. But sometimes it's not this dramatic, and sometimes it is. And so maybe God is calling you and asking you to leave expectations behind and follow him into something unknown. And then you'll want to do that, because the things that he's got you coming towards are much better than what you are currently doing. But there's actually more going on here than just us wanting to be like the disciples, to follow Jesus into the unexpected. Because when we look a little bit deeper, we kind of can understand why Jesus' sales pitch works on them and why they leave. And it has to do with expectations. But at a surface level, kind of, you see the expectations that are on these disciples. But on a little bit deeper, can you see the expectations that we have for God and how he doesn't necessarily stay doing what we would expect? So when we go back to verse 16, we see something different here with Jesus. He's on the move. This is different. It might seem pretty standard to us because we're familiar with these stories, but this is different. For the people living in this time, this is a very different way to think about God working. Before this, and if you look at what John the Baptist is doing just before Jesus, he's standing in the wilderness doing things, and people come to him. When you want to worship God and you're wanting to go to the temple, you have to go make a journey to where God is, and you have to come to God. In the Old Testament, the prophets, you would go to the prophets for help, for healing, for different things. You see lots and lots of stories of people traveling to them. Now, God is doing something different. Now, Jesus is coming to these people. That's different. Don't miss how different that is. And not only is he coming to these people, he's intentionally picking the people that he wants to follow them. He's passing all the busy people, and he's going to Andrew and to Simon and saying, come and I'll teach you how to fish for people. He's passing up the hired help in the Zebedee family, and he's saying to James and John, come and follow me. It's an intentional thing. And when the Creator comes to them, the God who created everything, and looks them in the eye, it doesn't really matter what he says, you follow. But in Mark, something is getting reminded of for the people that he's calling. And this would be something that, there's a story that this is reminding the people of. And it would remind Mark of this story. It would remind James and John and Andrew and Simon. All these people would be reminded of something like this happening. Because all Jewish boys would have heard this story over and over and would know it. So this is the story that they are reminded of. Centuries before this happened. Before the Sea of Galilee was even called the Sea of Galilee. Centuries and centuries before. Before the nation of Israel even existed, let alone was an oppressed nation, there was a man who was these guys' ancestor. His name is Abraham. And God did something new for him. He called him and he said, leave your father and mother and go to a place I will show you. This would be a reminder for them that God had started doing something new by going to somebody and calling them away from their family to do something unknown. Now God is on the move again. And he's calling these disciples to leave their father and mother and to go to something unknown that God will show them. It's another new thing that God is up to. It's the next stage in his great rescue plan for the earth. What it's doing is it's taking Simon and Andrew, James and John away from being the followers of their ancestor Abraham, and it's making them new ancestors of us. They're now our ancestors because they listened to the call of Jesus and they left everything and went. God is saying that the expectations for this family of Abraham, are different and are changing. And God is calling them to something new. That old family business is over. the expectations that people have of God, and that's what Nathan was talking about last week, is that that God would give them their land back, that he would rebuild their temple, and he would restore their nation. Those expectations are going to be fulfilled, but Jesus is coming in a new way, and he's going to fulfill those expectations in a way different from what the people are looking for. So the bigger question here then is, what are our expectations of God? Are they too small? As we find out for these disciples, and as we continue to read through Mark, we're going to find out that they didn't understand what new thing God was calling them to, but they did know it was something, and they know that they wanted it. And they were ready to be surprised by this unexpected God, because they know that God's surprises are always good, always kind, and always worth it. God's surprises are always kind, they're always good, and they're always worth following. They could have said no. They could have said, no, I don't want to fish for people. My family and my society expects that I'm going to stay here, and God's going to restore the things that I long for in the ways that I expect that he will. They could have said that. But then they would have missed God at work. They would have looked and looked for this, and then they would have said, where's God? He's not doing this. Why is he not moving when we ask him to? And they would miss that God's kingdom is breaking into the world. They would miss what Jesus is about to do. God's not just unexpected in this way. He's unexpected in all through the Bible. Think about the way that he chose to restore the world to himself. He chose a tiny baby to come to the world, an unexpected baby, a surprise for his mom. And then, in an unexpected way, in order to kill death, Jesus dies. Well, that's unexpected. And then for his followers, the real unexpected thing is he doesn't stay dead. He comes back to life. That's a surprise. He's still surprising us now. If we think about the ways that he is working at PAC, the 4 loves that we have, those are unexpected, those are surprising. And we're seeing him surprise us more and more. Stories of people going in for surgery and having the doctor say, you don't need this, you can go home, you're fine, you've been healed somehow, it's gone away. We're hearing stories and seeing things with reconciliation, like at school we see some of the students that we have, they're First Nations, and when they're waiting for their bus, they are dancing and showing their teachers different dance moves and having their teachers try them out as well. And the teachers say to them, you are making God smile when you dance and when you worship in the way that is right with your culture. And so we're not just interested in having people all follow God, look exactly the same, and act all the same. You can be a First Nations person fully involved in your culture and still following Jesus fully. Just like you can be a British person fully involved in your culture and following Jesus fully. Just like you can be a Canadian mix of all different kinds of ethnicities fully involved in your cultures and following Jesus fully. And so those are beautiful things to see. Those are surprising things to see, especially in a Christian school with the history of residential schools with First Nations people. It's really surprising to see and really beautiful to see. Think about the way that God is using our church to be multi-site. We're not just looking at Nipawa and all the surprising things that happen there, like a building that people just want to give us. And now we're looking to Dauphin. God continues to surprise us and surprise us. Think of the things that are coming into our town for economic development, like all of the jobs and the businesses that are coming. Those have been prayed here, but God is doing things that we're not expecting him to do. But then we think about him as individuals. How is God surprising you? I was thinking about this, and one of the biggest ways that God has surprised me, actually in my life, is you, PAC. Because I was thinking about how foreign it was when I was encountering the story of Steve. Because here, it's never been that I should be somebody different than who God's called me to be. And here, I absolutely love that this is the community where my kids got introduced to God and who he is and what he looks like. And they know that he looks like their teachers and their Sunday school teachers and their daycare people. That's you guys. You guys are doing that. This was a huge surprise for me. PAC and Portage weren't even on my radar. But you are one of God's big, kind, and happy surprises for me and for our whole family. So thank you. It's the same as for the disciples as it is for us. Jesus is pursuing you. He's looking at you, and he's asking you to follow him. He's asking you to follow him, the unexpected God, in unexpected ways. And even though we don't know what's coming, and we don't know what's going to happen, we can follow him knowing he's surprisingly good and surprisingly kind. We can refuse, and we can say, no, you're going to show up just as I expect, but then we'll miss what he's doing. So there's a few ways that we can respond. First, if God's calling you to the unexpected, the prayer team is going to come, and I invite you to come and pray with somebody about that. Pray to see where God's hand is moving, and pray for discernment as you do that. But if you're looking at this and you're saying, actually, I don't see God working. I don't see what he's possibly doing with this. I don't see him anywhere. And you want to see him surprise you, but you're not sure how, then the best thing to do is to come for prayer too, and to pray through your specific situation, asking God to show you his eyes to see what he's doing and where he's moving. But for all of us, even those of you who come for prayer, and for all of us, we can respond with confidence knowing that God is surprising us. If you're going through a difficult time, we all know that he's going to bring you through it. And that is reason enough to party. And if you're enjoying a season of surprises by God, well, then that's reason enough to party too. So we're going to party. The band is here. We're going to play. As soon as they start playing, you can go and get your kids and bring them back here, and we're going to sing a few songs together and enjoy each other's company, enjoy God and his goodness, and then we get to party Olive Garden style with soup, salad, and breadsticks. But we get to do this because this is worshiping God. Enjoying each other's company, enjoying good food is just the sort of surprising thing that would put a great big smile on God's face and would exercise our hearts to look for ways that God wants to continue to surprise us. So let's stand and sing.